Every farmer paid $400 to clear brush. He rented 5 goats for $20 and cleared 40 acres. The scrub had been gaining ground since August. That was the first real problem. Cedar and mesquite had crept up from the south pasture over the course of 2 dry summers, and by the fall of 2003, the back 40 acres of Ruben Garza's property in Frio County, Texas, looked less like grazing land and less like anything at all. Just brush. Thick, low, reaching in every direction, the kind of growth that pulled fence wire down and swallowed it. The kind that took land you'd spent years improving and turned it back into something useless. Ruben was 61, had been running a small cow-calf operation on the same 280 acres east of Pearsall since 1979. His father had cleared this same land before him. His grandfather had broken the first soil here in 1941. The family had been fighting this country's natural tendency to go back to brush for 3 generations. And they'd been winning. Mostly, the back 40 was a loss, at least that fall. He tried the herbicide route 2 seasons prior, hired a spray operation out of Cotulla to come through with a truck-mounted rig, triclopyr mixed to a 25% solution, 2 passes over 38 acres. Cost him $1,200. The cedar came back the following spring. Not all of it, maybe 60%. But the mesquite came back stronger. The chemicals had weakened the cedar long enough for the mesquite to spread unchallenged. That was the trade he'd made without knowing he was making it. The spray company had done what spray companies did. They sprayed what was there and left. No follow-up. No second application at the contract price. Second application, if he wanted it, was another $800. He'd paid the $1,200 and watched the results. Partial, temporary, the cedar weakened, and the mesquite moved into the space the cedar had vacated. He'd talked to the owner of the spray company about it. Drove to Cotulla on a Tuesday. The man behind the desk said herbicide on cedar was always a multi-year commitment. Said he could have told Ruben that before the application if Ruben had asked the right questions. He put a brochure on the desk about a 3-year chemical management program. Estimated cost for 40 acres, all applications, $3,400 to $4,200 depending on conditions. Ruben took the brochure. Drove home, put it in the same kitchen drawer where he kept tax documents and things he hadn't decided on yet. The county extension office in Pearsall had a recommendation sheet. Ruben had read it 3 times. Mechanical clearing with a root plow, followed by herbicide, followed by broadcast seeding with native grass. Cost estimate in the margin of the sheet, $350 to $400 per acre. On 40 acres, that was $14,000 to $16,000 minimum. Equipment rental alone ran $280 a day. Root plowing took time. The ground was caliche heavy, a slow job. He didn't have $14,000 earmarked for brush. He had $14,000 earmarked for a new water storage tank and 600 feet of pipeline to reach the north pasture. That was the project that would actually grow his herd by 4 to 6 head next year. The brush clearing was maintenance. Expensive maintenance on land that wasn't even currently productive. He couldn't justify spending production budget on non-productive land. He folded the extension sheet and put it in the dash of his truck. Left it there for 3 weeks. The idea came from his neighbor, Tomas Villanueva. Tomas ran a few goats along with his cattle. Small mixed operation, 180 acres on the west side of Frio County Road 12. He'd mentioned it in passing at the Stripe station in Pearsall one Tuesday morning in November. Said he'd seen a rancher down in LaSalle County who'd been putting goats to work on cedar. Not just letting them graze, deliberately running them through brush on a rotation. Said the results were worth looking at. Ruben didn't think much of it that morning. He'd heard about goats and brush before. General knowledge, nothing specific. He thought about it on the drive home. The problem with the back 40 wasn't just the cedar and mesquite. It was also the prickly pear that had colonized the flat sections near the dry creek bed. Prickly pear grew fast once the grass competition thinned out. It was low-value forage, water-intensive, and it spread laterally. A root plow would shred it, but the root fragments would resprout. Herbicide on prickly pear required 2 applications minimum, 90 days apart. The extension sheet put prickly pear control at an additional $40 per acre. On 20 acres of infestation, another $800. He stopped at the gate to the back 40 that afternoon. Got out. Walked in 30 feet. The cedar was shoulder height in the dense sections. The mesquite was older, some of it chest high with trunks as thick as his forearm. The prickly pear ran in patches 20 to 30 feet across near the creek. A man with a chainsaw and a bulldozer could get through this. A man with chemicals and patience could get through this. Both of those options cost money he didn't have set aside for this problem. He stood in there for 5 minutes, listened to the wind move through the cedar branches. Then he drove to the library in Pearsall. The county library had a periodical collection that included back issues of Texas A&M's AgriLife extension publications. Reuben spent 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon reading about targeted grazing. Not just goats. Sheep, too. But goats specifically had a documented history with browse species: cedar, mesquite, chinook, prickly pear. They didn't just graze grass, they ate woody plants. Preferred them sometimes. A goat would strip bark from cedar, would eat mesquite pods and knock back new growth, would consume prickly pear pads, spines and all, once the plant was knocked down or burned off first. One publication from 1998, a rancher account from Edwards County, described putting 18 Boer Cross goats on 60 acres of cedar for a 3-month rotation and achieving 70% canopy reduction. No chemicals, no equipment, just managed grazing with temporary electric fence. He read that paragraph 3 times. 70% canopy reduction on 60 acres in 90 days. He wrote the figure down in the small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. Then he wrote down the name of the extension agent who'd authored the piece. A Dr. Wayne Holt, stationed out of the Uvalde office. He called the Uvalde office the next morning. Holt had retired in 2001, but the assistant at the desk knew the study Reuben was describing and transferred him to a current agent named Sandra Perez. She had run similar trials with goats on juniper in Kinney County. She talked with Reuben for 22 minutes, gave him numbers. Goat density per acre. Duration of rotation cycles. Supplement requirements to keep animals healthy on pure browse. Minimum temporary fencing specifications. She also told him where he could rent goats. That was a sentence Reuben hadn't known was something he could say out loud and have it mean a real, practical thing. Renting goats. But there was a small operation in Uvalde, she said, run by a man named Ernesto Cuellar, who hired out meat goats for exactly this purpose. Browse management. Land reclamation. He rented by the head, by the week. Cuellar provided the animals and transportation. The rancher provided feed supplement, water access, and temporary fencing. Reuben wrote down the number. It was a Thursday afternoon in December 2003. He called Cuellar the following Monday morning. Cuellar ran 340 Boer Cross and Spanish mixed goats on his home place near Uvalde, and he'd been hiring them out for brushwork since 1999. He charged by the head, by the week. The rate in December 2003 was $4 per animal per week. A minimum rental of 5 animals. Reuben did the numbers while Cuellar was still talking. 5 goats for 1 week was $20. 5 goats for 4 weeks was $80. For a month of work. On 40 acres, He asked Queller how many animals he'd need for 40 acres of mixed cedar and mesquite and prickly pear. Queller said it depended. Dense cedar, you want pressure. Sparse, you could get by lighter. For 40 acres of what Reuben was describing, he'd suggest 12 to 15 animals in a rotation, working sections of 8 to 10 acres at a time, cycling through every 3 to 4 weeks. More animals would be faster. Fewer animals meant longer rotation, less pressure, slower results. Reuben asked what 12 animals for 8 weeks would cost. Queller said $384. Reuben asked what the Extension Office recommendation for 40 acres of mechanical clearing ran. Queller laughed, said he'd heard that number before. They agreed on 12 animals, 8 weeks, starting the second week of January 2004. Queller would deliver and pick up. Reuben would handle temporary fencing, supplemental hay, and water. The temporary electric fencing was the additional cost. Reuben needed to subdivide the back 40 into 5 sections of roughly 8 acres each. The fencing ran on a solar-powered energizer. He rented the energizer from the co-op in Pearsall for $18 per month. He bought 1,400 feet of polywire at 9 cents per foot and 60 temporary step-in posts at $1.40 each. Total fencing cost $210.30. That was a one-time cost. The wire and posts were reusable. Total investment $384 for goat rental, $210 for fencing materials, $18 for the energizer, call it $615 for the whole operation. On January 14, 2004, Ernesto Queller pulled into the property at 7:40 in the morning with a gooseneck trailer carrying 12 Boer Cross does. They were moderate-sized animals, most of them around 90 to 100 pounds, ears-long, pale brown coats with white patches. They were not agitated in the trailer. They were calm. That was the first thing Reuben noticed. Calm animals when unloading meant they'd handled this before. He'd sectioned the back 40 into 5 zones the week before. Zone 1 was a tight 8 acres of cedar on the northeast corner, the densest section. That was where Queller suggested starting. Put the animals in the worst of it first. Let them establish browse habits on what they were there to eat before they had access to anything softer. He opened the gate to Zone 1. The 12 does walked through and started feeding within 3 minutes. Cedar does not have thorns. That's an important distinction. Mesquite does. Prickly pear does. The goats went to the cedar first, which made sense, easiest access. They stripped lower branches, ate young shoot tips, pulled foliage down from anything they could reach. They did not eat the woody trunks. They ate leaves, small branches, bark on the younger stems. By the end of the first day, the 8 acres had visible gaps where there had been continuous canopy. Reuben checked the water tank twice that first day. Full, he checked fencing at dusk. No gaps. By day 3, the goats had worked through the upper 2/3 of Zone 1 and were concentrating on the mesquite at the south end. Mesquite presented differently. The thorns required the animals to work around them. They targeted the seed pods, still clinging to lower branches in winter. The pods were high sugar forage. The goats knew what they were doing. By the end of the first week, Zone 1 looked different. Not cleared, not bare, but lighter. Canopy was broken up. Sunlight reached the ground in sections it hadn't touched in years. The grass beneath, what was left of it, showed signs of responding. Dry season dormant grass will green up fast when light returns. He moved the animals to Zone 2 on day 9. Zone 2 was a 10-acre section of mixed mesquite and prickly pear near the dry creek bed. This was the section Reuben had been most uncertain about. Prickly pear, fully spined, was a question. The extension publications had mentioned it. Queller had confirmed it when they spoke. Goats would eat prickly pear, but the spines needed to be addressed first. Fire was the traditional method. A quick pass with a propane torch over the pad surface, singeing the spines without burning the pad itself, left the tissue available to eat. Reuben had a torch. He spent 4 hours on a Saturday morning with the torch, working the denser prickly pear patches in Zone 2. Singeing pads. The smell of burned spine is sharp, acrid. By noon, he'd treated maybe 60% of the prickly pear in the zone. The untreated sections he marked with orange flag tape to come back to later. The goats went into Zone 2 that afternoon. By the end of day 2, the treated prickly pear was heavily worked. The animals were methodical. They didn't eat down to bare ground. They grazed selectively, taking the fleshy pad tissue, leaving the base. But the pad tissue removed was the tissue that stored water and fueled regrowth. A pad stripped to its base had a poor recovery rate. Week 3, Zone 3, another 9 acres on the western edge, lighter cedar growth, more open, some sections nearly clear already. Week 4, Zone 4, the flat center section, grass coming back in places the cedar had broken open. Week 5, back to Zone 1, second rotation. By the time Zone 1 had its second rotation, the difference was measurable. Reuben walked it on a Sunday afternoon. He'd been doing this every week. Same route, same direction, tracking what changed. The cedar canopy that had been continuous shoulder height growth was now broken up with 40 to 50% open sky visible from ground level. He could see clear across portions of Zone 1 that had been impenetrable in January. The goats were pushing the remaining cedar back further on each pass, stripping the lower growth that anchored the shrubs to light. He took a photograph on his phone. Wasn't sure why, just wanted the record. The previous photograph, taken in late December before Queller arrived, showed solid brush. The February photograph showed something that looked like a pasture with brush in it, a meaningful difference. A working difference. Reuben's neighbor, Dale Hoffman, who ran cattle on the property directly north along FM 1433, came by in early February. Said he'd driven past the back fence on his way out and wanted to see what was happening over there. Walked the fence line with Reuben for 20 minutes. Didn't say much. Looked at the ground. Looked at the cedar. Looked at the goats working in Zone 2 through the wire. He'd been ranching Frio County land for 28 years. He knew what a recovering pasture looked like versus a worked-over one. He asked how much it cost. Reuben told him. Hoffman didn't say anything for a moment. He kicked at the soil near the fence line, where new grass was already showing in a section that had been buried under cedar duff 2 months ago. He asked how long until the back 40 was ready to run cattle again. Reuben said spring, maybe summer for the heavier sections. Hoffman drove off without another word. Came back 2 days later and asked for Queller's number. Week 6, Zone 5, the remaining 11 acres southeast section. This was the oldest mesquite, the thickest trunks. The goats couldn't kill a mesquite with a trunk 4 inches across. That was a biological fact. Mesquite root systems are deep, persistent, regrowth-oriented. What the goats did was exhaust the canopy production. Strip the top growth repeatedly, force the root system to spend energy regenerating above-ground mass instead of expanding laterally. Done often enough, it weakened the stand. It didn't eliminate it. But weakened mesquite on a 3-year rotation with cattle would decline. Queller had explained this clearly when they'd first spoken. Don't expect a magic result on old mesquite. Expect a management result, sustained pressure over time. The goats weren't a one-time fix. They were a cost-effective rotation tool. Week 7, Reuben walked all 5 zones on a Saturday morning just after sunrise. He'd been doing this every weekend. It was colder than it had been. Mid-January cold pushing back through in mid-February. Frost on the grass at 6 in the morning. He walked Zone 1 first. The cedar canopy was 60% gone. Bare root crowns sat in open air. The remaining cedar was stunted, slow. The grass below was coming in. Not thick yet. Thin, green, early-season growth. But present. Zone 2, the prickly pear, was down 50% in the treated sections. The untreated sections, which he torched in a second pass 3 weeks in, were showing similar results. Prickly pear removed at the pad level without herbicide typically saw 30 to 40% regrowth from the base in the first year. But the canopy competition from cedar was also gone in this zone, which changed the soil moisture balance. Less cedar meant more moisture available at ground level. That slowed prickly pear recovery. He counted something in Zone 3 that morning, just walking the fence line, noting by eye. The cedar that had been there in January was maybe 35% of what it had been. Not gone, not cleared. But 65% reduction in a section that the extension sheet would have quoted $350 per acre to address mechanically. Week 8, Queller came back with the trailer. The 12 does walked onto the trailer the same way they'd come off. Calmly, they'd done this before. Reuben helped load. Took 20 minutes. He gave Queller a check for $384. Queller said the animals had looked good, healthy, not showing stress. Said they'd worked hard ground. Reuben asked if Queller did spring rentals. Queller said he had a waiting list. The back 40 in the spring of 2004 was not a cleared pasture. That was the honest accounting. It was a recovering pasture. The cedar was broken up, canopy reduced by 55 to 65% depending on the zone. The mesquite was present, but knocked back, stripped of seed pods, showing the slow signs of root system stress. The prickly pear was down 50% in the treated sections. The grass, and this was the part Reuben had not expected to see as quickly as he did, the grass was returning. Buffalo grass and Cytioates grama coming in across the floor of zones 1 through 3, not thick, but present. The root systems had been there, dormant, waiting under the duff. The light the goats had opened up had done the rest. He put 14 cows on the back 40 in late April 2004. That section had been unproductive since 2001. 3 years of lost carrying capacity. 14 head at current market weight represented about 140 animal unit months of forage production. At roughly $35 per alm value, that was close to $5,000 in annual forage production, coming back online from a section he'd spent $615 to address. His neighbor Hoffman ran 2 goat rotations that same year. The first on his west pasture, the second on a brushy section along the creek. He called Reuben in July to say it was working. Reuben put together a simple cost comparison that summer, not for anyone else, just for himself. A folded piece of notebook paper, pencil figures. Mechanical clearing, extension recommendation, $350 per acre minimum, on 40 acres, $14,000. Goat rotation, 8 weeks, 12 animals, $615 total, per acre $15.37. One more figure he wrote down, the carry cost of not clearing. 3 years of lost production on 40 acres, estimated at $4,800 per year in forage value. Total carry cost of the brush problem, 2001 to 2004, $14,400. He'd cleared the land for $615. He'd let the problem sit for 3 years and lost the equivalent of what mechanical clearing would have cost anyway. That was the calculation that bothered him most. He used goats again in 2006 on a different section, 22 acres on the north side of the property that had been going to cedar since 2002. 2 rotations, spring and fall. 8 animals each rotation. Total cost both rotations, $480. The cedar on that section was manageable by the end of the year. He used them a third time in 2008, following a drought that had weakened his grass stands and let brush move into areas he'd thought were stable. 6 weeks, 15 animals, the worst sections on the south boundary. $450. Queller expanded his operation. By 2007, he was running 600 animals and had a waiting list that ran 3 months out in spring. He'd hired 2 full-time hands and bought a second trailer. The ranchers in Frio and LaSalle and Zavala counties had figured out what the equipment rental companies hadn't wanted them to figure out. Ruben retired from full-time ranching in 2017. His son Marcos took over the operation. The back 40 was still productive pasture, still running cattle. The cedar had come back in places, as it always would in this country. That was the nature of the land in South Texas. You didn't clear brush once, you managed it. Ongoing, indefinitely, Marcos put goats on a section of the property in 2019. Same approach. Temporary fencing, Queller's operation, now run by Queller's son-in-law. Same rotational logic. 11 animals, 6 weeks, $330. The Extension Office recommendation had gone up. The sheet Ruben had read in 2003 quoted $350 to $400 per acre. By 2019, the number was closer to $600 per acre for mechanical clearing. The goat method had stayed $15 to $25 per acre. Ruben drove out to the back 40 once in the fall of 2021. He lived in Pearsall by then, had been in town since the retirement. He parked at the gate and walked in 30 feet, the same distance he'd walked in December of 2003 when the land was solid brush from fence to fence. The cedar was present. It was always present, but manageable. There were cattle grazing in the middle sections, Sidioids grama and buffalo grass, thick enough to hold the soil together. He stood there for a few minutes, listened to the wind. The notebook in his shirt pocket still had the figures, $15.37 per acre. Still the most useful number he'd ever written down. Still the answer to a $14,000 problem that turned out to cost $615. He folded the notebook back into his pocket, walked back to the truck, drove home. The goats had done the work. The land had done the rest.